Hello, welcome. I am Dr. Ravi Shankar, and I'm just here to give a little book talk about my new memoir, Correctional. I know it's a chilly winter night, and so hopefully some of you that couldn't make it tonight are enjoying this broadcast on HCAM. It's my pleasure to see the audience out there. And I was just going to tell you a little bit about this book and read you a selection. Correctional just came out last year with University of Wisconsin Press. I was a finalist for the Connecticut Book Awards, and though I'm a well-published poet and translator, it's my very first memoir. And it's a story about many things. There's a lot of strands in it. It's the story of my parents' immigration from South India to the US, where I was born in Washington, D.C., and grew up as a bicultural American. It's also the story of a couple of unexpected encounters I had with the criminal justice system, beginning with a wrongful arrest in New York City, where I was stopped under Mayor Bloomberg's stop and frisk policies. And then later, when I was very stupidly driving on a suspended license and violated my probation, and I actually had to do 90 days at Hartford Correctional at a time when I was being promoted to full professor at a university in Connecticut. And so really, some of the darkest, most despondent moments of my life, and yet something that when I look at in retrospect was a blessing, kind of allowed me to find out about the shadow America that I knew about theoretically, that I had read about, but to experience it firsthand really opened my eyes in a very big way about myself, but also about the country that we live in. And so I'll just read you a little section here that begins when I first had to do this, and you'll have to kind of read the book to find out all of the circumstances that went into this event. But I'm going to skip to the middle of the book here, when I first have to enter Hartford Correctional, which is it's a correctional facility in Hartford, and it holds primarily pretrial offenders, so people who are waiting for their court case. I mean, part of my education was meeting people who I never would have spoken to in my normal life and finding out about them. Some of the people I met had very minimal cash bonds of $1,000 that they couldn't pay, and had been waiting for months for their court date. But I, of course, had maybe a speeding ticket, but never really had this kind of encounter, and so was terrified. I was a professor, Indian-American professor, going into a space that I only really knew about from television shows that I'd watched and books that I'd read, and so I was quite fearful. And so I'm just to put you in my shoes and in my eyes when I'm entering. So this is from the chapter called Unexpected Commencement. We arrive at Hartford Correctional Center and are led up a ramp and into a brightly lit hallway dotted with cells, the faces of shadowy men pressing up against them. I try to shift the ordeal into an aesthetic experience, an act of immersion journalism, but I fail. Waiting on another length of bench to be unshackled, I'm panicked and exhausted, barely holding it together. Once we're uncuffed, we're thrust into a bullpen filled with men in no mood to talk. My head swims in a fog of exhausted unknowing. After a long while, I'm called forward, identified, fingerprinted, photographed, and like part of a cattle herd, stored in another bullpen. Then I'm told to strip, to trade my laceless shoes for a pair of black martial art style slippers, which I'd later learn were called Jackie Chan's or Skippies. I stand naked in front of a correctional officer or CO in an open cubicle. "Check him out, Ramirez," the CO processing me sniggers, seeing my hairy body. "This one, he come with a built-in sweater." My court clothes go into a box and I'm given a tan uniform, a little too tight, a little too short. When I sit down outside a set of double doors marked emergency, a skinny guy with rasping breath and horn-rimmed glasses sits beside me. "Hey, I'm Jay. You're new here, right?" He speaks as if we might be office mates at a corporate law office. "I'll let you know what's about to go down. We're not headed to the dorms or the blocks. Summertime in Hartford, crazy. Never seen it so crowded in here. My boy said they're putting guys on the gym floor now. We wait to speak to the male nurse who takes my vitals disinterestedly and asks me very few questions. The mental health counselor asks me even fewer. I hesitate when asked if I've ever contemplated thoughts of self-harm. By the time we're given a bedroll and directed to follow a CO, I don't know the hour. After all that waiting, we're led through a gauntlet of metal detectors. We walk past what looks like the mural of the world begun by children and then abandoned so that Eastern Europe trails off into the cinder block. Wait behind me in single file, the CO commands. He searches his utility belt for a key. When he opens the double doors, the yawning space before us is indeed a poorly lit gymnasium. Dozens of dark shapes loom on the floor, resolving into shapes of men. A small village worth. We sleeping on boats, Holy Mother, no, Jay groans. Worse than I thought, they got us on the gym floor. Around me is a mass of human fellows in jagged rows. A few are covered completely, wrapped in blankets like corpses, and others are on their mattresses, shivering, snoring, or going through what might be termed mild seizures. Some men are huddled together or gesturing in the air with unmistakable, inscrutable resolve. Others are splayed out prone, eerily motionless. Near the rear of the gym, I'm given my own flame-retardant mattress and a gray plastic boat, a stackable bunk without any component parts that could be weaponized. I anchor next to 100 other men. This can't be legal under the city's fire code. I'm exhausted. It's the middle of the night, but the fluorescent lights are still on. It's pure pretense they give COs light for medical emergencies because their main purpose is to create sensory deprivation. I spread my sheet and blanket atop the mattress on the plastic boat, rolling the extra t-shirt into a lumpy pillow. What I see around me looks like a makeshift shelter after nuclear fallout. I notice some of the other men around me have somehow acquired possessions that spill over the sides of their beds. Pyramids of balled-up toilet paper or mildewing styrofoam cups from which the stub ends of pencils stargaze. Others have flipped their bunks to make an impromptu card table and sit in knots throwing spades and diamonds. One man, shrouded in his blanket like a Bedouin, stares expectantly at a television housed in plexiglass, even though it's not turned on. Two COs sit behind a glassed-off area accessible only by intercom, next to a bathroom that looks like a busted-up mouth with 2 of the 3 stalls missing doors. Jay crouches next to me conspiratorially. Just you wait. Some senator or fire inspector come through, they send us out to the rec yard to hide the boats. This be straight illegal, but summertime in Hartford, Gold Coast to broke, who cares what's legal? I'm thankful Jay's boat is many quadrants away, since in the few hours I've come to know him, he's asked me for tissues, to make a phone call for him, and whether I could help him buy some pills. His manner of asking for something reflexively presupposes assent, a junkie trait I will come to recognize in time. For now, engulfed in a miasma of fear, shame, and humiliation, balled up on state-issued sheets, trying not to think about the grim reality of the next few months, I can only sense the world in terms of relative danger. For the most part, Jay seems innocuous, even intelligent, and is a source of perpetual new information, so I would be glad to have him as a confidant during the day. But for now, I need to sleep with half an eye open and to wish him away. So that's just one of the many people whom I met. And in writing this book, I also did some research. I had an international fellowship at the University of Sydney and wrote a PhD kind of looking at the roots of mass incarceration and its racialization and thinking about why in America, the greatest country on earth, where we have freedom of our liberty and pursuit of happiness, why 25% of the world's prisoners come from this country, even though we represent maybe 4 to 5% of the world's population. And what is it about the kind of punitive streak that we have where we're perhaps not able to forgive. These were all some of the things that I was thinking about. And this book is really, I mean, part of the reason I wrote it, it was because I needed to reclaim my story as a public figure in Connecticut. There was news articles and television shows about me, and so I needed to kind of reclaim my voice and tell my story. But more importantly, I think, the men whom I met, who I would have presupposed I had nothing in common with, men I probably would have been totally afraid of, who I got to know and realized that I shared a lot of the same hopes and aspirations. I have a couple of daughters. I saw pictures of these men's children, and they made me promise them that I would do something with their stories, that I had a voice, and I made a promise to them, and that is part of the reason why I wrote this book, Correctional. But it is a book that has a lot of different strands. There's this undercurrent of Buddhism, and it's also in some ways a love story. And I think that element probably should have been brought to the surface even more, because it is a book about finding community and learning to forgive yourself and working actively for a more equitable world. And so that is ultimately, I mean, I've been told it's quite a page turner, and it's a story, while true, is also harrowing and funny in parts, but most importantly, I think, is my hope that it's not just a dead literary artifact, but something that makes us want to get involved in whatever local, regional, or national way we can to help change things. Because what my experience was that there wasn't, rehabilitation was rhetoric. What was really happening was dysregulation, and these men, some of whom had mental health issues or substance abuse issues, none of that was really being addressed, and many of them left in worse shape than when they came in. And I guess that was the other thing that I thought about, that this is not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue, but we're, as taxpayers, spending so much money on this system that is clearly broken. If you look at the rates of recidivism in the US compared to the rest of the developed world, it's among the lowest. A place like Norway and Scandinavia that has among the lowest rates of recidivism, the conditions there in the correctional facilities are really quite different. The men and women there are taught a trade, they're given counseling because they're going to re-enter society, and it's a benefit for everyone if some of these issues could be addressed, rather than them being punished even more than being away from their families. And so this is something that I had always known, but after my experience have really started feeling very passionately about. I teach at Tufts University at the moment, and I also teach classes at MCI Concord, a medium security facility, because I'm a big believer that bibliotherapy and telling your own story is one of the first steps in the healing process. So I want to skip ahead to the other element in this book is that there are these 6 letters. And I come from, my family comes from South India, Coimbatore and Chennai, what used to be called Madras. My mother tongue was Tamil. And I, as a young boy, moved from the US back to India to live for 18 months to take care of my grandmother. And I often thought about that experience growing up, being a little too Indian in America, being too American in India. It's a very common immigrant experience, but one that I think shaped my young life. And so I decided in this book to write these 6 letters that form a kind of narrative spine in the book. And each of the letters is addressed to someone whom I love, whom I feel like I might need to make amends with, or explain something to, or ask questions of. My parents, my daughter, some of my male friends, and since my partner Julie is here, I thought I would read the penultimate letter, which was addressed to her. And she's someone who, and I think this is true anytime you go through something difficult, certain people who you never expected to be there are there in very big ways, and other people who you might have been close to back away. And you end up finding out, it's a litmus test of loyalty in a way, and I know personally that I never would have been able to survive my experiences, nor, to be fair, write this book without Julie. And so This is my letter to her. It's called Manpani, which I will also say, the reason there are 6 letters is in India, in South India, there are 6 different seasons. In addition to the 4 that we have here, we're right now in the midst of a pretty brutal winter. Hopefully spring is on the way. But in South India, there's also monsoon season, the season of very heavy rain, and the pre-vernal season that comes before springtime and kind of sets the ground for the blooming to come. And this is actually set in this season. This is Manpani, which is winter. Dear Julie, in our path, to quote Hafiz, the sky has strewn pearls from the necklace of the Pleiades. When I think of us, even in the rack of all we've been through together, it's our first night that I conjure with an instantaneous quiver of recognition. The sky was the starriest pool I've ever stepped foot in, and holding hands, we glowed phosphorescent in the moonlight, not knowing how our first touch might, despite all odds, eventually grow into an unorthodox life. You had shared half your hummus sandwich with me in a church pew earlier that afternoon, and I had eaten it. Both of us starved for someone with whom to have those conversations that we've only had for ourselves for so long. It's not the first time I'd been unfaithful, nor the first time I'd fallen in love with a woman who was not my wife. That time when I briefly left my marriage to sublet a flat in New Haven that smelled of wet dog and shoe polish, I'd had my heart broken. I've so thoroughly walled myself off from how devastated I was back then, it's hard for me to even conjure that relationship fully now, though I know I'd been in love and I'd struggled hard not to be. So no, you're not to blame for the dissolution of my marriage, just as I'm not to blame for the breakdown in yours. It's hard to trundle the love between us into verbs, to sketch the lines of magnetism that have kept us coupled even as we defy expectation, being years, ethnicities, often cities apart. If you were me and I you, the world would tolerate us a little better. Still, there's no denying that on one another's arm we light up a room, that we both share a way of seeing and making that's remarkable. It's not to brag, but to affirm, because such affirmation is needed, given how many people, including our own families, have wanted to keep us apart, and given how much pain our pleasure has engendered. If only everyone could see how you fit like a key in the latch of my shoulder, how in another life we lived overlooking the sea with a brood of raven-skinned, vibrant-eyed, lithe beauties darting between our legs. In this one, we survive incarceration, legacies of depression and abuse, intramedular spinal cord tumors, the falling out of families, and homelessness in its many guises. Though coincidence, such misfortunes aren't the karmic punishments for the choice we made to be together, but the necessary side effects of trying to get it right, to stop pretending. Plus, did we really ever have a choice? True love compels, and each time I put my mouth on yours, the firmament unfurls a little further. We are all exiles from another place, put on this planet to grope our way forward in the dark, to find someone who sees us in all our inglorious imperfection and loves us anyway. It's the rarest, most precious gift. My own days are proof of the flux of fate, and so while our promises are written on the wind, and I can't foresee the future, I do know that the connection between us was meant to be. No matter where on and beyond this earth we go, I won't stop loving you, which, I suppose, is one version of eternity. Your beloved. These letters are constructed and they're intimate, and yet they, I think, represent part of what I would spend time doing was writing letters and waiting for letters. And that feeling of knowing that you didn't have any interior private space in a place like Hartford Correctional. Even the letters that you would read, were already have been opened and read by someone else. Your phone calls are being listened to. And so, I tried to put everything I was feeling down into these notebooks that became the material from which this memoir arose. It took a lot of time and a lot of shaping and reshaping to tell the story in the way that it's being told. I might just, the other thing about this story, and I think what makes my story maybe a little different, and there's a number of really remarkable, and I think the more stories that we have, because prisons, of course, are meant not just to keep people in, but to keep the public out. And there is a way in which your humanity is surrendered the moment you walk through the door. You're given an inmate number. You don't have a voice. You're spoken for by attorneys and public defenders. And there's a lot of unknowing and a lot of anxiety about what's to take place. I think that what I realized is that this system that we have built, that we've poured so much money into, is not really a very effective deterrent. It's not improving our public safety. And in fact, if we look at who is being incarcerated, and of course this is probably, many of us have watched the documentary The 13th or read The New Jim Crow, but seeing it firsthand was pretty remarkable. I'm teaching this class right now, and I just had 7 students. All of them were men of color. Again, it just made me ask these questions of what it means to be an American and to live in a society where we, instead of dealing with some of the root problems, which I think could be addressed by more funding for community organizations and better education initially, because the ripple effect, the generational trauma that's caused by the acts of incarceration, or even, I didn't read the very first section, but the stop and frisk example, where over 800,000 innocent New Yorkers had been stopped under this policy. And so even if nothing happens to you except that you're stopped and you're looked askance at and you're treated as a criminal for a moment, it has this psychological weight, and it becomes a burden that you have to carry with you. And so I think, in a lot of ways, writing this book and meeting the men that I met just kind of broke my heart wide open, and it made me feel like I want to tell this story. And my story, I guess, is a little unique in that I'm someone who has both benefited from enormous privilege. I talk a little bit in this book about my father's immigration from India. He came over in the 1960s, and of course part of the history of the US is that there have been these very restrictive immigration practices, from the Chinese Exclusion Act to immigration quotas that really, if you were from Western Europe, you were privileged, and the rest of the world got a very tiny sliver of that immigration quota. And that changed in the 60s. My father came over, but Indian Americans generally are among the highest grossing immigrant communities in America. And I had a loving family, if difficult Orthodox, and probably a little abusive in some ways, but I had a lot of privilege. I went to excellent universities, and yet I, at the same time, was discriminated against, especially after 9/11, which I write about in the book as well. I lived in New York at the time. And I think my story, because it is inflected by both sides of that divide, by someone who both knows and has seen privilege, and yet someone who has been discriminated against and spoken to people who have been oppressed on the basis of their ethnicity or the color of their skin, makes this story a little unique. And I think it has allowed me to empathize with all human beings, no matter where they come from. And so maybe just in closing, I'll just read one little final section from this book. And I'll read right from the end of this book here. This is from the epilogue, and this book, like, if I had known how hard it would be, and writing a memoir is different than writing poetry or writing fiction, because you're writing about real people and real events, and every time you revise, there has to be another vulnerable exposing, another unpeeling, until you can get to the truth, the authenticity, to the things that you're afraid of expressing to yourself, let alone to the world, I think is where the heat of a real story comes from. And because it took so long, By the time the book was about to come out, there had been, of course, some other additional changes, and by which I'm talking about George Floyd and everything that happened in the summer of 2020. And so this is right from the very end of the book. This is from the epilogue, and I will finish my little discussion today by reading this section. In December 2020, a year that saw the death of George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, Daniel Prude, and Breonna Taylor at the hands of police, a crane lifted a nearly 3,000-pound bronze statue from its granite pedestal, not far from where I live, in Boston's Park Square, which had once stood since 1879. The Emancipation Group Memorial itself, a replica of a Washington, D.C. statue, depicted a godlike, fully attired Abraham Lincoln standing over a kneeling, near-naked, still-shackled black man. The man is, according to historian Kirk Savage, the very archetype of slavery. He is stripped literally and figuratively, bereft of personal agency, social position, and the accoutrements of culture. Frozen forever in this unfortunate juxtaposition, the monument is not really about emancipation, but about its opposite, domination. If a better visual embodiment of white savior complex has ever been crafted, I don't know what it could be. Moreover, as cited in the Washington Post, of the more than 5,000 public statues depicting historical figures in public squares and parks throughout the United States, less than 400 of these monuments are women. We don't have to look hard to see how racism and sexism color our governmental institutions and permeate our consciousness. Spearheaded by Boston artist Tory Bullock, the Boston Art Commission decided in 2020 to take down the statue, giving it the same fate as the other Confederate and colonialist monuments around the country. Statues, unfortunately, are easier to move than minds. All it takes is a crane to hoist an offensive reminder of our history onto the back of a flatbed truck to be buried in some official depot's basement. But the reverberations of that mentality continue in the inner workings of everyday life and stay buried within our institutions. Just by making a statue disappear or by entombing an entire class of people in prison will never heal the original wound that arises from the fact that nation building has been a brutal, racist, inequitable practice that unjustly shapes the lives of generations of citizens. For true reparation to happen, we must acknowledge the enduring legacy of injustice by confronting those who've been wronged and ourselves directly, while also doing the policy work behind the scenes to transform policing, adjudication, sentencing, parole, and reintegration. My own life, it only overlaps briefly with these larger social justice imperatives, though my experiences have made it impossible for me to avert my gaze while those around me suffer, and while others around me, either intentionally or complicitly, help cause that suffering. The generations who come after us may well look at mass incarceration and social media shaming the way we regard medieval bishops who, while building exquisite cathedrals, came up with the most ingenious ways to torture their fellow human beings. We refuse each other's subjectivity because we're scared of difference. But your pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness does not threaten mine, so long as we can agree on the assumption of privilege that puts that goal at an unequal distance for each of us. I began work on this book because I promised the men of Dorm 4 and Hartford Correctional I would help share their stories. They might never have the chance to get their voice back from the court documents and psychiatric records, but I can use mine to loosen their closed fists and reveal our shared humanity. Those men are all around us. I'm one of them. I've had to reclaim my own voice from the Hartford Current and from the blogosphere, from Amma and from Appa, from the lies I told myself because I was hurting and did not know how to confront the pain. I knew how to mask it, but never could quite drink or drug away. There's so much I wish I could whisper in the ear of that awe-stricken boy lying on his back on a rooftop in Madras, watching the swirl of stars overhead in a delicious moment of respite from the sweltering summer heat. Everything back then seemed imbued with such magical possibility. My cousins and I were separated by oceans, but we were family. You could eat sweet pongal with your hands or cornflakes with a spoon for breakfast. Somehow Pac-Man had reached the shores of India, but not Donkey Kong. It all made such perfect sense. Now, I wake up each morning with the intention of perceiving again with such non-judgmental curiosity. Some days when I wrap my arms around my beloved, laughing after getting off the phone with my daughters, our dog sniffing and wagging around our feet, miso soup on the stove and the Japanese maple flaring darkly crimson in the window, everything seems so tender and possible and alive and intended. I just never imagined that I would have to lose so much to come this close to feeling free again. And so that's right from the end of the book, and I think I will stop here. I know if anyone has questions, you can always follow me. I'm on the socials at Impurpler, and I teach creative writing and other workshops at Tufts University. I live in Providence, and happy to share my story and also to point you in the direction of local organizations that are doing a lot of the work that I hope to get the word out about criminal justice reform, but also working with the homeless, working with other marginalized communities. So it's been my pleasure to be with you. Thank you all. Stay safe. Keep your minds and heart open. And I hope to see you around.